Hey, welcome back to Unschooled Theology. I am one of your hosts, Derick, and with me is Evan. Good day to you, sir.
Good day to you, sir.
All right, we are in Genesis 3 here, moving
Excellent.
along, and we're hitting the real climax of this story. So let's read Genesis 3 verses 4 and 5, which says, "But the serpent said to the woman, 'You will not surely die. For God knows that when you eat of it, your eyes will be opened, and you will be like God, knowing good and evil.'" All right, so just what exactly the serpent is saying here actually has been a matter of debate, which I think is interesting because it sort of adjusts how you might interpret what is going on here in this moment. Because what the serpent's saying is not really grammatically very clear, is what many of the translators and commentators say. It's kind of murky, I guess, and doesn't quite make sense. One translation that seems to me at least actually be better in keeping in tone with sort of what the serpent says following and kind of where things have been building towards here is that what the serpent is saying is actually, no, it is not, you must surely die. Like, you must surely die in quotes, right? Because
Mhm.
that's sort of what Eve said. And then he goes on to explain the rest. So he's sort of saying, no, it's not that you will for sure die. um,
Mhm.
and that's interesting. So the reason this kind of makes sense to me is that uh, a serpent, a tempter, right, is
Mhm.
actually most dangerous to us when they're not fully lying, right? Because if he says, well, you will surely not die, right? If that's really what the serpent is saying, well, that's a lie, right? That's an out and out lie. But if he's saying, no, it's not surely you will die, if what he's saying is saying,
Oh, okay.
well, you might die, but you might not die too,
So
right?
he's calling in, he seems to be potentially calling into question the guarantee of death.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
So,
Yeah.
and that's where the order of the words, that's why you're saying grammatically is versus what order do you put surely and not in? Because you could read it as you will
Right.
not surely die, which is saying it's not sure that you're going to die. Or he's saying you will surely not die, which is saying it's certain that you're not going to die.
Sure. Or even if you're saying you will not surely die, that's still could be saying, flipped around the other way too. That's the problem, is grammatically, this, even in the English,
Yeah.
like, there's so many ways you could interpret that phrase, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
It could mean a bunch of different things. What does the not relate to exactly?
Well, and this is
The phrase as
perhaps
a whole, one of the
one thing
words.
one thing to take note of is this is where surely is intended to be, I'm sorry, I'm thinking of airplane this whole time, but
Yes.
surely is intended to be surely is intended to be the type of word that establishes more almost more of something, like full clarity,
Right.
as opposed to something that's kind of vague. And it makes me kind of go to thousands of years later where Jesus says, let your yes be your yes and your no be your no.
Right.
Because if the serpent says something to the effect and removes the word surely here and just says you will not die, there's no ambiguity with that.
Right. Right.
That's a guarantee. But adding the word surely in there actually makes this more ambiguous, which is very interesting to note when you're talking with temptation and trying to. It seems like that might be one of the reasons that Jesus says that, which always
Mm-hmm.
sounded weird to me. Like, why does he care if we're saying yes and no? Like, why does he care about the superfluity, whatever? Why does he care about excess words?
Right.
But they do matter.
Mm-hmm.
If you're just simply clear about what is and what isn't, then there's not room for temptation. There's not room for the vagaries. There's
Right.
clarity.
Right.
And what the serpent does and what's brilliant about the temptation is it introduces, I'm not so certain. Like
Right.
where is the line? I don't know. This line has been blurred just a little bit.
And it makes sense for us to interpret it this way rather than say, oh, well, the serpent was lying. He was saying she wouldn't die, right? Which is,
Mhm.
I think, what I've heard a little too often when this passage is talked about. It's, well, the serpent lied here. He said Eve wouldn't die.
Yeah.
And that's, no, we were just told just a couple of verses ago that the serpent was the craftiest, right?
Mhm.
The cleverest of all the
Mhm.
beasts. And so it makes sense to look at this and say, well, no, why would he be boldly just lying? We're told he's crafty, so there's probably something crafty about what he's doing
Yeah.
here.
Yeah.
And
There's
this
something.
idea of saying, no, it is not, you must surely die, it's leaves open what's sort of unsaid is, well, you could die or you
Yeah.
could not, right?
There's
That's what he's kind of getting at here, and that makes much more sense in terms of being a crafty tempter.
yeah. There's definitely something to the idea that it's harder to tell the truth than it is to not lie. So a
Yes, yeah,
lie is typically a little bit more bold of a thing, but it's very easy to like not fully get to the truth, but to
right,
kind of like
right,
sit right on the edge and do something that kind of rhymes with the truth, but you can add more words into it to make it feel like, to make it to skew the truth a little bit.
right.
And that's to underestimate the I think it's to underestimate what temptation actually looks like and how it actually functions in the world,
Mm-hmm,
is to
mm-hmm.
say, oh, look, it's just outright lies. It's like, no, typically that's not the way it works,
No, because
because
an out
people
and
don't
out
fall
lie
for
can be
outright lies.
dismissed,
Yeah, yeah,
right? If it's an out and out lie, you dismiss it. Whereas half
exactly.
truths, they're more
Enticing.
challenging to deal with, right? You have to sort of parse out, well, what about that was true, what wasn't? And so the idea that what the serpent is saying here is something along the line of a half truth, that makes a lot more sense in keeping with, the serpent as he's been described so far, and actually
Yeah.
what we'll see coming after this. um so I think that for me personally, that's the phrasing that I interpret this verse with, is that idea. um but I will say that what we're going to discuss here in a minute, as we really talk about what this means, um the familiar phrasing works too. Again, when we consider closely the idea, as you were pointing out, of the word surely being included, because that phrase introduces some doubt. But the phrasing that we just talked about, I'll say it once more for clarity's sake as I knock the blinds. No, it is not, you must surely die, right? That phrasing, I think, makes it most clear, what we're going to talk about in a second.
Yeah.
And then there's one other thing I want to point out here, that in verse 5, there is a second, the word here for God the first time, and then the second time, it is Elohim both times. But the second time, it should actually be translated gods. That's because in the first time, the word knows is in the singular form, but the second time, knowing, is in the plural form. So if we read it that way, then it would say, well, I guess we add both. But the serpent said to the woman, no, it is not, you must surely die. For God knows that when you eat of it, your eyes will be opened and you will be like gods, knowing good and evil.
Mm.
So
Mm.
that is interesting, to keep in mind.
Yeah.
And I think that's important because, again, going to the craftiness of the serpent, I'm pretty sure, the woman, and again, we're taking this sort of as a story, but we know we can't be God. That's not that's not a problem. We know that.
Well,
Um,
by definition, at least as far as humanity, um, meaning man and woman, has interacted with God up until now, the only thing that has been presented is that's a singular position. And so let's put it like, if somebody is president, we have one president at a time, and either the president is out of office or they're incapacitated or killed, and then one other person occupies it. But if you were to present it like there could be presidents, multiple, plural, we have an oligarchy in that position, then all of a sudden it opens up that possibility in the mind of like, wait, there's multiple people that can occupy that position.
Well,
So
maybe
I'm able to not dethrone God and still occupy that. So we can both be like that in the
yeah, I
same
don't.
way that.
Yeah, I wouldn't even say necessarily it's about occupying that. It's more like I can be a lesser version of that. I can be closer to being what God is. I can be a little g gods. Offering that possibility, that temptation in there. So, but we'll get to that more in just a second. But again, that goes to the craftiness and the half truths. So if we look at this section here, it's made up of two phrases, and I think it's important because the verse where it splits, right, and reinforces this idea of the first phrases or the two phrases. Because the first one is that idea that, well, it's not a sure thing that you will die, right? You could, but it's not, guaranteed. And then the second phrase after that is like a justification for the first, right? Because basically the serpent says, well, it's not a sure thing you'll die, because after all, you'll be like God, or perhaps, gods, right? And then so the serpent is sort of saying, well, if you become like God, maybe you don't actually have to die. Maybe that's not the consequence of that, right? Maybe you can avoid it then if you now know these things. And I think that works better because the serpent knows he can't quite convince the woman that she would be absolutely on par with Yahweh, but maybe he can convince her, well, you'd be a little g gods, if you do this. And that evil does result in death, right? That idea holds. But if you know good from evil, perhaps you can avoid ever doing evil, right? And so then you wouldn't actually die. That's the kind of thinking that could be sort of wrapped up in this verse. That could be the crafty way in which the serpent is trying to portray this to the woman. So this goes to that idea of the serpent offering an incomplete truth, which is more powerful than a lie because it's harder to identify and it's harder to confront too, right? A truth that doesn't tell the whole story is much harder to confront. And that, by the way, is real deception. Lying is not deception. It's not deceit. Because again, if it's a lie, if it's an out and out lie, if it is just simply incorrect, that can be confronted, right? And you can say, well, no, but here's the opposite, right? And I see that the opposite is true, so that's not. But if it's a partial truth and you're building something out of that can't really be proven right or wrong until something occurs, that's sort of a real deception.
There's a way.
And so I'm making a distinction between a lie and a deceit. I guess you can lie without deceiving, if that makes sense. But I'm suggesting that this is actually deception.
Yeah, I think it hits that the harder task is telling the truth than simply not lying.
Right.
Simply not lying. You can be selective with the things that you present, and that doesn't present the entirety of the truth.
Yes.
For instance, what I look at here is he's saying you will be like God, and then gives an instance in which you will be like God, knowing good from evil. But what's left out is all the ways you won't be like God.
Right.
And so in that capacity, you might know good from evil, but you might not have the capacity to bear the knowledge of good and evil.
Right.
And so that's a big difference. And it's like the analogy I would use would be somebody who's looking, let's say, up a corporate ladder at somebody, and looking at somebody who, let's say, makes a ridiculous amount of money in a managerial position or in some other position, in like a position that requires a lot of intelligence, let's say a doctor or something like that. And they might be jealous of the salary, and they might look at it and say, I want to have that salary. And if they were to eat a magic fruit that would put them in that salary, but all of a sudden they also have the responsibility and the weight of bearing all of that. They might not have the capacity to do it.
Right.
So they've
and so
managed to magically all of a sudden have this thing, but not the capacities that the other things have. And so that's where it's like, okay, be careful what you're actually wanting. Be careful what you wish for, because those things come along with a whole lot more. Being God comes
that's
along
the key,
with that.
right? This is why, well, you will die, right? You may not surely die, but you will die, is because we don't have the capacity to always follow through with the good, right?
Yes.
Humans can know, the difference between good and evil. We just don't have the capacity to always, do the good, right? That is not who we are. So one other thing I think I want to point out here too is that the serpent seems to present God as having some kind of like nefarious reason for keeping the humans from this tree, because he says, well, God knows you'll do this, right? But he just doesn't, he doesn't want you on his level or something like that. Now that's interesting, because that reflects sort of what surrounding mythologies would sort of say about human life being a struggle against the gods. That's very common in ancient Mesopotamian myths and Babylonian myths, Egyptian myths. All these sort of surrounding mythologies have this sense in which humans are struggling against the gods. But of course, what we see in a few moments here is that really human life, it's actually about a struggle to return to God. It's not a struggle against God, it's a struggle to return to him. And so that sort of flips things on its head. And so I find it very interesting that in the serpent's temptation, we see the temptation to believe the false religions, right? Essentially, what one of the components of the serpent's temptation here to the woman is to say your struggle is against God. And all those ancient religions or mythologies and all of that was built around the idea of your struggle is against God's. And so it's just interesting to see that temptation put in there. And that, of course, is one of the temptations to sin, is to see life as this kind of thing where you have such a burden upon you, and you're fighting against the forces that are around you, right? And this again, this sort of flips it on its head and says, well, no, in the sense in which you are fighting things around you, you're fighting to return to God. You're not fighting against him. So I think that's interesting. And it's just kind of another example of how these biblical ideas are kind of revolutionary compared to their surrounding counterparts.
Yeah. So, and it's not like that doesn't feel self-evident at times.
Yeah.
It's not you don't have to make a hard case to say the world is a hard place, and you are struggling against something.
Right. And so it makes sense that the ancient mythologies would build that idea, into their perspective. So
yeah. And it's not like the Bible doesn't contain many things that discuss that.
Right.
And struggle with that reality, and struggle with suffering, and struggle with the fact that
but it's interesting to see like it captured in the first temptation,
Yeah. Well, I mean, that means that it's so fundamental that's one of the fundamental things that might lead you away, is that reality. I ran into this the other day thinking about the Psalms, because growing up, when I would read them, I would oftentimes look at them and say, kind of, this is really repetitive, and there's like over 100 of these, and there's not an immense amount of variation. And I would be books that are really close to each other in the Bible is Proverbs and Psalms. And I would look at the Proverbs and I would say, man, this is way shorter and way more packed with content, way more variation, way more interest. There's so much more, and it's wisdom. But I thought about it. It hit me the other day that the wisdom of the Psalms is in their quantity and in their repetition, because the gist of the Psalms is that God is good, and God will continue to support you. And it's like, man, looking around, I'm realizing, that's a buttress against nihilism. That's a buttress against looking at the world and saying there's something fundamentally wrong. And even, you look at these ancient religions and it's like, well, this is a more narrative based nihilism, that we are at odds with the gods and we're constantly fighting with them, except nihilism is fully giving up, but
Sure.
it's still that same idea. And so that's the power.
Comes from the same root, for sure.
Exactly. Yeah. And that's the power that's found in the Psalms, is them saying, no, we're going to repeat over and over and over and over again in small variations the same idea that God is good, and that there is a fundamental good that we are following, and in a way striving to be, but even just more so recognizing fundamentally there's a goodness at work here too. And that is, I think that's significant, because it's very, very easy, and probably seen here in the first temptation, to believe the opposite,
right,
and to be enticed by the opposite, that look, it's all fundamentally corrupt, there's something actually that's trying to just ruin everything. And there's a lot of evidence that you can build against that. So that's I don't know, I think that's why the Psalms are very, very significant.
They are. Yes, indeed. All right. So one other thing I want to mention too is that there's a way in which this actually echoes back to Genesis 1:1 in the beginning. Because in that episode, we talked about how not being God is sort of the central issue that every person must come to grips with. That's one of the things hinted at in the phrase in the beginning, is you're not God, because God was beyond time, right? He was there in the beginning. And the serpent's temptation here is to say, try to become as close as you can to becoming God, right? That is what you need to be doing is, you're not God, but the way to handle that, the appropriate way to handle that, is to try to become as close to being God as you can, right? That's why you should eat of the fruit, because you'll become closer to being like God. And interestingly, I think we talked about the other part being sort of a reflection of early religions. Here, I think actually in that we see sort of a reflection of our modern ethos and way of thinking, and the modern secular religion, right? Where I think people do effectively try to make themselves gods, right? They try to, either through acquiring as much power and resource and control and those kind of things, they try to do that, either by acquiring more, or in some cases acquiring less. What happens is people try to shrink their lives as much as possible to only those things which they can try to influence and control, right? But I think we see that same sort of temptation there. So the temptation of the serpent here, interestingly, to me at least, it seems to include a reflection of ancient temptation to see, the gods as enemies, and kind of modern temptation too, of, well, we need to become gods, right? I mean, frankly, if you even look at the work of what is the guy's name who wrote the book Sapiens? I forget his name. It's a tough name to remember.
Yeah, it's an Israeli name. I can't remember his name.
Yeah. Well, I was listening to a talk just the other day where he talked about how the next phase of humanity is producing minds and consciousnesses, and you will be able to shape these minds and consciousnesses and all of these things. And it very much to me sounds like, oh no, you're trying to become a little g God, basically, is what you're trying to do. And that is, I think, what a lot of people do attempt to do. And I think if we look closely at the steps people take in service of trying to become a little g God, I think that is the pathway to sin. I think we can see that in many places. So I just found it interesting that is wrapped in here to the temptation of the serpent. So
I tend to see it as a I'm distracted by that thought. I think I'll address that first, because that feels like a which would be surprising from that person, because while I haven't read *Sapiens*, but that feels like a misunderstanding of how incredibly complex humanity actually is, how
Yeah.
strange humans are actually as creatures.
Well,
We
but
aren't,
at the same
we
time, that's what
operate.
he's sort of saying is, well, if we can start to create these things ourselves, we can shrink them down and make them simpler. And I mean, really, honestly, it's almost like, you know, you're creating cattle at that point, not people, you know,
Which is true. Well, that's,
like
and
a
that's,
lesser thing, you know.
which
Yeah.
it is. It absolutely is a lesser thing. That's why I wouldn't refer to it as humans. It's
Right.
it's fair to refer to it
And he
as
didn't. He said minds
intelligence.
and consciousnesses,
Yeah, that's I think that's an
which is weird.
I don't know exactly. I guess that leads to a very probably a question that would be too long for this episode. But what would you
Right.
mean by consciousness then?
Of course.
Like,
Yeah.
what do you actually mean?
Yeah.
Because
Or
there's,
even mind, you know, what do you really mean
what do you
there?
really mean
You
by
know?
that? Yeah.
Yeah. It's it was creepy, let's put it that way. The discussion, it's worthwhile.
Yeah.
But I guess
I think,
my point is mostly that it shows just how far people are going now in the direction of trying to become little g gods, right?
yeah, I think there's two things that connect with this, that feel very appropriate. I don't like to, and maybe every age runs into this. So I guess it's not foolish for me to say this encapsulates what our age is. We've talked about that with these stories, that the power of them is that they tend to apply despite your time period, your time frame. And so the way I see this manifested in our current culture is there's two phases to what's going on here. Is there's the degradation of the sacred in hope of making things better. So I'm going to degrade the thing that God has identified as sacred. And there's a prohibition around sacred things typically.
Oh yeah.
There's a reverence. And so this is like, that fruit is prohibited. It's sacred in that it shouldn't be touched. It should be reserved away. And then the insinuation that you will become like God because of it. And obviously maybe that's something to your advantage. And so I look at our current culture, and there's this sense that we need to leave the church. We need to not just leave the church, but we kind of need to spit on it as we walk out the door, and point out all of the things that are terrible about it, and make nothing sacred, make nothing that we reverence in the world. And by doing so, we have the hopes of establishing a society that is perfect. There's an idealism that's going on, of how can we're going to make the world an almost perfect place, which is establishing like a heaven right here. And you can see this, I think, in the hallmark of this, I think, is how people respond when their plans are not put into place. Is their response anger, or is their response reservation and continued work? Because I think the Christian has the obligation, and we have the obligation of trying to better ourselves, better those around us, and better our world. But when we're not successful, we don't riot. When we're not successful, we're not called to riot in the same way.
Right.
We're called to actually just like be persecuted for it.
Yes.
We're called to just like take the hit, as opposed to trying to hit back. And so I think that's
the root of sort of Christian pacifism, right?
Yeah.
Is that idea.
Yeah. So I think that's you can see this kind of playing out even down to today. That idea of you're not God. Now what do? We're trying to establish ourselves as gods. And in the process of doing that, you have to destroy anything that was sacred.
I mean, you know, you are, again, the gardener idea, right? If we're made to be gardeners, you know, we didn't make the things that go in the garden. We care for them, you know, and now we're attempting to say, well, we don't know how to care for them, so I guess we have to make the garden from scratch,
Mhm.
rather than care for the garden that we're given.
Mhm.
And so, yeah, so the question, I guess, of whether or not one will eat the fruit of the tree. And again, we are looking at this as the story of universal sin, not original sin. So it's the temptation that the serpent offers is a temptation to all of us, right?
Mhm.
This is universally the temptation to sin. And so this relates back to the beginning, right? If the Bible opens with sort of that question of you're not God, so now what? It spends up until basically these verses explaining here's God's plan, right? And what's presented, here, and what the question sort of the serpent causes the humanity to struggle with is, will you trust what God knows and follow his plan?
Mhm.
Or will you assume an adversarial relationship with God and even try to become a small g God yourself, right?
Mhm. Mhm.
And so we can see that temptation too, that sort of the serpent's temptation here, it is not a singular isolated moment, right, in time, tempting a lone unnamed woman regarding some fruit. Like, it clearly is something deeper than that, right? Whether that happened or not, again, we treat it as that question sort of is irrelevant. What this clearly symbolizes here and what this is showing us is absolutely a universal temptation that no human can avoid, right? To be human is to struggle with this particular temptation. We all face down sort of this serpent-like temptation in life. So all right, on that hopeful note, we'll we'll go to listen. We've reached the point now in the Bible where there becomes a lot of lack of hope, and then eventually we get back to wonderful hope. So yeah, well, I guess we'll have a lot of episodes that led on a sort of not so hopeful note. But next time we will be back, we'll discuss Genesis 3:6. So until then, like, subscribe, follow, share with friends, comment on whatever platform you're on, leave reviews if you can do that on whatever platform you're on. Email us, unschooltheology@protonmail.com, and we will see you then.